You've arrived at the doorstep of a childhood so quiet even your thoughts might echo. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we'll tiptoe into a world where silence wasn't just golden, it was mandatory. Victorian children weren't taught to speak properly. They were trained not to speak at all. A velvet hush blanketed the Victorian home. The tick of the parlor clock seemed louder than a child's giggle. Why was it so quiet? Why were children punished for speaking above a whisper? Or worse, laughing? You'll meet toddlers coached in restraint, etiquette books that read more like survival manuals, and whispering games that were anything but fun. What kind of society values invisible children? And what happens when they grow up? If you find irony soothing and silence more trustworthy than today's headlines, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this sleepy little archive of odd history keep drifting your way. And if you're tuning in from a creaky old house or a dorm room filled with books and dust, let me know your favorite century to mentally wander through before bed. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't remember learning silence, it's simply expected of you. The moment you're old enough to toddle, you're shushed into submission. A velvet-bound etiquette book appears on the nursery shelf before your first picture book does. Children must be seen and not heard, it says without irony. Your nanny reinforces it with a raised eyebrow and a precise finger to her lips. Talking without permission becomes a moral offense, not just a breach of manners. The rules are painfully specific. Laughter is to be muffled, not released. Whispering is preferable, but still risky. What if you giggle? What if your breath hitches in amusement? The dining room becomes a performance space of quiet mouths and folded hands. Even playtime is policed. Dolls may speak, but only in whispers. Toy drums gather dust. Shouts are replaced by scripted dialogue, mimicked from your elders. Would you care for tea, you ask your stuffed rabbit who never dares respond. Etiquette manuals from the era detail behavioral codes for children as young as 3. They include such stern directives as avoid sudden movement, lower the gaze when spoken to, and converse only when invited. One guide even advises parents to rehearse silence with their children in the evenings, sitting still for up to an hour with no speaking only to prepare them for proper social visits. These weren't considered punishments. They were practices virtues. Historians still argue whether this suppression of speech was intended as moral conditioning or merely emotional control. Some frame it as part of a broader Victorian obsession with order. Train the child to be silent, and the adult will know their place. Others suggest it reflected a deeper anxiety about class and image. Only the lower orders were loud. But even in such stifled rooms, resistance flickers. Some children developed secret hand signals. Others, when caught laughing, claim to have been coughing. A clever few learned to communicate through coughs, chair squeaks, or tapping porcelain. Rebellion-like conversation just had to be quiet. The hush continues. Only now it follows you to breakfast, curling around the silver teapot like steam. The morning meal isn't warm or welcoming. It's a test. And the only sound allowed is the quiet clink of spoon against cup. You sit straight-backed at the polished table eyes on your porridge. The footman pours tea without a word. Your father rustles his newspaper, and even that seems too loud. Speak now, and you risk everything. A stray comment about the weather could earn a sharp glare, a whisper to your sibling disaster. This isn't just breakfast. It's a performance of control rehearsed daily. Victorian family breakfasts were often tense affairs. In many middle and upper-class homes, silence was not merely preferred, it was enforced. Diaries from governesses and household staff describe morning rituals marked by rigid order. Napkins were folded just so. Children entered in a line, took their seats, and remained still unless spoken to. Speaking out of turn or making a noise, chewing too loudly, clinking the cutlery, slurping tea might trigger swift discipline. In one account, a child dropped a slice of toast and was sent from the table without food. You learn quickly that breakfast is not for nourishment, it's a behavioral barometer. A spilled cup could mean extra handwriting drills. An accidental burp, a scolding in front of guests. Food itself becomes symbolic. Thick porridge to enforce humility. Weak tea to prevent overstimulation. One governess noted that the less appetizing the breakfast, the more virtuous the child became over time. The psychology of this quiet morning drama remains contested. Some researchers suggest it was a tool to instill discipline before the school day began. Others argue it reinforced hierarchical control, children at the bottom always being watched. Still others propose it was a form of moral theater designed to teach restraint, patience, and the Victorian ideal of emotional opacity. But even in this silence, anxiety hums beneath the surface. You dread the butter dish, it's slippery. You count the seconds between each spoonful of porridge, hoping your timing matches your sister's. You rehearse apologies in your head just in case something drops. There's no pleasure here, only the pressure to vanish, to become a model of stillness in starched linen. And yet, some children rebelled. One young boy scribbled rude jokes on toast with marmalade. A girl practiced dropping her fork at just the right angle to land on her brother's lap. A silent war of sabotage delivered in whispers and crumbs. Even now, the tension lingers. A breakfast table can feel like a battlefield. Every chair, a soldier, every plate, a trap. And you just want to chew without fear. Step outside after breakfast and the hush lingers like fog. But out here amid the garden hedges and gravel paths, playtime offers a strange twist because in Victorian childhood, even games flirted with death. Welcome to the world of doll funerals. You crouch beside a rosebush, small hands gently wrapping a cloth doll in scraps of black lace. A shoebox becomes a coffin, a garden trowel, the ceremonial spade. Your sister delivers a solemn eulogy while you hum a hymn half remembered from chapel. This is not make-believe in the modern sense. It's practiced mourning, ritualized, precise, and repeated. You don't laugh, you don't giggle, you play death the way other children play house. In Victorian England, death was everywhere and nowhere more visible than in the lives of children. With high infant mortality and frequent disease outbreaks, mourning was a constant backdrop to family life. Some parents, hoping to make loss less terrifying, encouraged children to rehearse grief through play. Mourning dolls, often dressed in black crepe or miniature veils, were sold as toys. These dolls had tiny coffins, sometimes trimmed with lace. Some were even displayed in glass cases during actual funerals, when a child had passed standing in for the deceased if no body remained. Historians debate the function of this peculiar tradition. Some argue it served a therapeutic purpose, letting children confront death in a controlled, symbolic way. Others suggest it blurred emotional boundaries, making grief performative rather than processed. A few scholars propose it was simply practical. When loss was likely, it helped to make mourning familiar. But for children, the experience could be hauntingly vivid. In one account, a girl described burying her doll beneath the gooseberry bushes every Thursday. She and her siblings would stage a full funeral procession, complete with handkerchiefs and faux sobs. Afterward, they would dig the doll up and start again week after week. The game, if it could be called, that wasn't morbid to them. It was normal. Just as tea parties taught manners, doll funerals taught grief. And in a world where siblings sometimes vanished between one Sunday and the next, perhaps it gave children a fragile sense of control. After all, here the doll always came back. Yet beneath the surface, something uneasy lingers. A generation taught to mourn before they could spell, to fold tiny hands in prayer over a painted porcelain face, to recite psalms by heart, not for salvation, but for practice. The line between imagination and preparation, between play and prelude, remains forever blurred. And when you fall asleep at night, it's not to lullabies, but to the quiet creak of a garden gate and the fading scent of fresh-turned earth. The garden fades behind you, but the rules follow you indoors into the nursery, where even your toys must mind their place. This isn't a room of joy. It's a small kingdom of order, and you are not the ruler. You open the toy chest, but not with wild abandon. A nanny watches from her corner chair, her knitting needles clicking softly like a metronome for your behavior. You reach for your favorite soldier doll, but pause. He's second in command. The general always comes first. You remember the rules. You learned them before you could tie your shoes. Victorian nurseries weren't simply playrooms. They were miniature models of the society children were expected to join. Toys weren't chosen for fun. They were chosen for function. A soldier teaches obedience. A maid doll teaches service. Even the dollhouse follows rigid roles. Papi in the study, Mama in the parlor, nursemaid upstairs with the baby. Disruption of this order wasn't charming, it was corrected. Children were often scolded for assigning toys the wrong roles. A boy who played too tenderly with a doll might be redirected to his lead battalion. A girl who imagined herself as a shopkeeper instead of a mother might have her tea-set privileges revoked. Some nurseries even had laminated charts drawn by governesses mapping out the hierarchy of play generals above soldiers, governesses above maids, humans above animals. Play was watched, noted, and sometimes rehearsed. Historians still argue whether this structure was a form of early social training or a more innocent attempt to mirror adult life. Some suggest it offered comfort, predictability in a chaotic world. Others insist it indoctrinated children into rigid class and gender roles long before they could challenge them. You might think a child would rebel, but in this world, rebellion was subtle. One girl named her maid doll Queen Victoria, prompting a quiet but firm correction. A boy gave his tin cook a sword and declared him head of the household. The nanny removed the cook for a week. Even more than rules, the nursery carried rankings. The best toys weren't necessarily the most beloved, they were the ones closest to the adult ideal. A doll in a nurse's uniform might be allowed to discipline the others. A soldier who spoke out of turn could be made to kneel on the shelf in disgrace. This wasn't imagination, it was rehearsal. You begin to understand. This isn't your room. It never was. It belongs to the future version of you, the one expected to marry, manage, and command. And every cup of pretend tea, every tiny hat, every whispered order to a painted figurine is another step down that path. Still, when the nanny isn't looking, you let the maid doll sit in the drawing room chair for just a moment, and that's enough to make your heart race. The nursery door creaks open to morning again this time, with a chill that bites more than the air. Today begins with water, and not the warm, comforting kind. No, this is the Victorian cold bath cure, and it's waiting in a tin basin by the fireplace, already losing heat it barely had. You strip down shivering before you even touch the water. Your nanny stands by, holding a towel like it's a finish line, not a comfort. You dip one toe, then the rest. The shock seizes your breath. You don't scream, you've been taught better. But your ribs tighten like shutters against the wind. Cold water immersion wasn't just a quirky household habit. It was a widely believed tonic, championed by medical thinkers of the time as character building and morally fortifying. Many Victorian families believed that warm water encouraged weakness indulgence or even scandalously inappropriate thoughts. Cold water, by contrast, was clean, brisk, and bracing. It aligned with values of toughness and discipline. If it hurt, it must be helping. Some children were bathed daily in icy water as early as age 2. Diaries from the period describe toddlers sobbing through morning plunges, parents standing by with pride. One account recalls a child trembling so hard he couldn't hold his spoon at breakfast. Another was praised for not uttering a word during his frozen scrubbing. Medical historians remain split on the intent. Some believe parents genuinely thought they were improving health and circulation. Others suggest the practice was more about moral symbolism, washing away sin, teaching endurance, or simply enforcing control. Cold was not just a temperature, it was a lesson. You learned to steel yourself, to not wince, to not cry. You memorized the rhythm, step in count, to 10, step out towel off, don't complain. The basin becomes a ritual object, your personal altar of suffering and stoicism. Some days the water has chunks of ice floating in it. Other days it just feels like liquid metal. Either way, it teaches the same thing: comfort is a weakness. Yet not every child accepted this fate quietly. One clever girl slipped a hot brick under the basin the night before. Another poured leftover tea leaves into the water to make it look dirty and be skipped. A third, more dramatic soul faked a cough so convincingly that her cold baths were replaced with mustard foot soaks, a marginal victory. Still most endured, because to flinch was to fail. And failure in a Victorian household echoed far beyond the bathtub. It marked you as soft, vulnerable, disappointing, so you breathe through it. The cold, the expectation, the quiet triumph of surviving another morning's trial. You dry off and dress in silence, your skin still tingling, your teeth not quite done chattering. And yet, somehow, you're proud. Or maybe just relieved. You're finally warm again, bundled into your school uniform, but your left hand betrays you. It reaches for a pencil, not with rebellion, but instinct. And then the correction comes, swift, silent, and stinging. In the Victorian classroom, left-handedness wasn't quirky. It was sinful, a flaw to be fixed. You're made to sit on your right hand during lessons. If you switch, you might be wrapped across the knuckles with a wooden ruler. Some teachers even tied students' left arms to their chairs with cloth bands or belts, forcing the right hand into awkward, trembling obedience. Writing the wrong way could be met with punishment and shame. To the Victorians, left-handedness wasn't just inconvenient, it was suspicious. The word sinister itself comes from the Latin for left. Many believed that favoring the left side indicated weakness, deceit, or even moral failing. Parents and teachers feared it marked you as defiant, undisciplined something, to be corrected before it spread deeper into the soul. One diary from a boarding school matron describes a boy of cheerful disposition who was considered troublingly left-leaning, not politically, of course, just physically. After 6 months of finger straps, hand slaps, and forced calligraphy drills, she reports him writing with acceptable stiffness in his right hand. The phrase feels almost proud. Scholars today debate the real motivations. Was this fear of the unknown a religious hangover from centuries of demonizing the left, or merely an obsession with conformity? Every child marching in step both figuratively and physically. Theories vary, but all seem to agree it wasn't about helping the child. It was about protecting the system. You try as instructed. The pencil sits awkwardly in your right hand, wobbling through your copybook. Your letters look like they're trying to escape the page. Your teacher inspects the results and nods not with praise, but with the grim satisfaction of winning. You're not better, just more manageable. Not every child accepted this quietly. Some became ambidextrous out of necessity, switching hands when unobserved. Others developed small tricks, tilting the page, hiding the left, under the desk, feigning clumsiness with the right. There's even a record of one boy who trained his right hand to write backwards, forcing teachers to reconsider whether the problem lay with the hand or the system. But for most, the message was clear: don't stand out. Don't be different. Even something as small as a preferred hand could mark you as flawed. And in a world obsessed with moral posture, flawlessness wasn't optional, it was survival. You stare at your smudged letters. You miss the ease of your natural hand. But you say nothing. You can't afford to. So, you grip the pencil tighter and try again, your right hand trembling, your left buried beneath the desk like a secret. You shuffle into the classroom with your shoulders tucked low, not from the weight of books, but from the weight of fear. Victorian schoolrooms weren't spaces of curiosity. They were theaters of discipline, and every lesson doubled as a test of composure. The teacher doesn't yell yet, but the silence suggests he might. You don't dare fidget. Your boots stay flat on the worn wood floor, your eyes fixed forward. Behind you, a classmate lets out a sigh and immediately regrets it. The room tightens. The ritual has begun. In many Victorian schools, fear was not just tolerated, it was cultivated. Classrooms were arranged like stages with the teacher positioned high on a dais, watching rows of desks below, like a judge presiding over a courtroom. Children were trained to sit still for hours, backs, straight hands, folded, mouths closed. Any slip a wrong answer, a twitch a whisper, could provoke punishment, sometimes physical, always public. One peculiar exercise involved shame drills. Pupils were made to practice being reprimanded, complete with mock scoldings and recitations of guilt. Some were required to rehearse standing in disgrace at the front of the class for imagined infractions as a sort of preventative embarrassment. The idea was to make shame a familiar companion less surprising when it arrived for real. Educational theorists today disagree about the purpose of such routines. Some frame them as character building, designed to instill resilience and discipline. Others see them as tools of social control, ensuring children would grow into obedient workers and subdued citizens. A few argue they were simply a product of a broader culture that prized emotional restraint over intellectual curiosity. But whatever the theory, the result was the same: you lived in dread of the teacher's voice. Not because it was loud, but because it came without warning. The sudden call of your name could turn your skin to ice. The chalk screeching on the board might mean a pop quiz or a trick question, and worse still, your mistakes weren't private. They were theater. A public spectacle designed to instruct others through your humiliation. Some children cracked under the pressure, others adapted. A few even thrived not by learning, but by mastering the cues. They memorized the teacher's expressions, predicted moods, timed answers to the second. Survival became a performance art. And while the lessons were dull, the real education lay in anticipation, in endurance. You glance at the blackboard. You don't understand the math problem, but you raise your hand anyway because not raising it might be worse. Your heart pounds. The teacher looks your way. You brace for either praise or punishment, unsure which one you fear more. Behind you, another student whispers an answer under their breath, risking both punishment and favor. That's the gamble. You all play it daily, and no one ever wins. But you keep sitting, keep still, keep silent, because that's the first subject you're taught here. Not reading, not writing, fear. There's a rhythm to punishment here. It doesn't arrive in chaos, but with ritual. You don't stumble into it, you are summoned. The desks are pulled back. The room reshapes itself. It's no longer a classroom, it's a stage. You know what's coming. Everyone does. A classmate has misstepped, spoken out of turn, scuffed a boot, hesitated on their recitation. The offense barely matters. What matters is the performance that follows. The teacher produces the cane like a conductor lifts a baton. The silence is total. In many Victorian schools, corporal punishment was a rehearsed act. It wasn't just correction, it was ceremony. Desks were sometimes rearranged into viewing arcs, creating an audience of trembling witnesses. The child being punished was made to stand on a platform or a designated mat awaiting their sentence. The number of strikes was rarely spontaneous. It was recorded, measured, and occasionally displayed on a chalkboard. One record notes a standard 5 boy receiving 6 for insolence, 5 delayed, delayed for dramatic effect. Children were also made to keep punishment logs. In leather-bound notebooks, they'd record their infractions dates and the type of discipline received. Some schools require teachers to initial the entries, making punishment an official exchange like signing off a ledger. These weren't tools for reflection. They were ledgers of guilt, inked in order. Historians continue to debate the psychology of it. Was this justice intended to instill fairness and consequences, or was it theater aimed at spectacle and fear? Some argue that the formality added a grim dignity to discipline. Others suggest it was pure control cloaked in routine. You sit still, heart thudding. Not just for your classmate, but because next time it could be you. One mistake, one moment of visible emotion, one breath out of rhythm. You watch the cane descend. You hear nothing but the rush of your own pulse, and then the sharp smack of wood against cloth and skin. No one cries. That's another rule. Crying is a failure, not of nerves, but of discipline. Even the punished child seems to brace with pride a slight lift in the chin. You almost envy them for having survived. Later, the desks return to their places. Lessons resume as if nothing happened, but the space still holds the tension. You glance at the punishment log in your desk drawer. It's mostly blank, but you know how easily that changes. Still, some children rebel in their own quiet ways. One boy deliberately filled his log with invented infractions, forcing the teacher to review and correct his fictional crimes. A girl wrote hers in code using flower names instead of offenses. Violet for talking, Thistle for eye-rolling. She said it made her feel less owned, but most just adapt. They learn the timing, the pageantry. They master the art of silent endurance. Because in a place like this, suffering is not just expected, it's choreographed. And the curtain never really falls. Even when you're not being punished, the room reminds you that guilt is always an option. A wooden chair in the corner, a little too tall, a little too plain, waits in silence. Its back faces the wall. Its purpose is simple to make you feel small. This is the guilt chair. You don't sit in it casually. You are placed there ceremonially by a teacher or nanny. No lecture follows, only silence and your own thoughts. Or perhaps you're given a single instruction. Think about what you've done. You're not quite sure what that is, but you sit anyway, hands folded, eyes fixed on cracked plaster or wallpaper seams. Time-out spaces in Victorian households and schools weren't designed for calming down. They were designed for self-condemnation. Some corners were labeled with carved plaques or hand-painted signs, idle, disobedient, wicked. A few had mirrors hung just above the chair, forcing children to stare at their own reflection. One governess called it the chair of consideration. Another simply called it the seat. These weren't isolated measures. They were part of a system. One that believed children must internalize shame early to develop proper character. You were expected to feel bad not just about actions, but about instincts. Talking back, laughing too loudly, daydreaming. Historians remain divided. Was this quiet discipline more humane than corporal punishment, or just as damaging in its own subtle way? Some argue that it encouraged emotional regulation and personal responsibility. Others say it laid the groundwork for anxiety, self-doubt, and lifelong fear of mistakes. Either way, the goal was clear: create a child who monitored themselves before others had to. You remember the chair well, the hard edge of the seat beneath you, the strange acoustics of your own breathing in a corner where sound didn't quite travel, the way time felt slower there, longer, more personal. A few children tried to make the space their own. One carved her name into the seat back, as if to say, "I was here and I survived." Another scribbled jokes on the wall in faint pencil, invisible unless you squinted. Some whispered stories to themselves, anything to fill the vacuum of guilt with something warmer. But most just sat, still, quiet, learning not to cry, learning to appear calm, and learning slowly that the chair wasn't just a place, it was an idea. That shame could follow you even when you left it. You step out of the corner when allowed. You return to your desk or your chores. Nothing has changed outwardly. But inside a new layer of silence settles in. One you've built yourself. Because by now, you don't need the chair to feel guilty. It's not just the nannies and teachers watching. Sometimes it's someone far closer. Your own governess, that quiet figure trailing you from breakfast to bedtime, doesn't just dress you or brush your hair. She observes, records, reports. You laugh a little too loudly after a lesson. That evening, you hear whispers behind the drawing room door. She smiled when told of the neighbor's funeral. Your governess murmurs to your mother. A worrying lack of empathy. You hadn't smiled at that. You were thinking of something else. But the moment is logged now in ink. Some Victorian families employed governesses not merely as caretakers, but as moral surveillance agents. They tracked not just behavior, but expression. Children's faces were scrutinized for signs of selfishness, vanity, or disobedience. A lingering grin, an arched eyebrow. These weren't quirks. They were symptoms, indicators of moral character. And so emotional privacy became a foreign concept. One method involved mood journals, daily ledgers, where governesses noted each child's demeanor, cheerful, sulky, anxious, defiant. These logs were shared with parents, sometimes read aloud over tea. Some families even asked for weekly virtue reports, rating their children on traits like humility, patience, or temperance. A child with too many deficient marks might find privileges revoked, books removed, outings canceled. There is no scholarly consensus on whether this was intended as affection or authoritarianism. Some historians interpret it as early psychological care, a clumsy attempt to understand and shape emotional development. Others see it as surveillance dressed in lace, a way to keep children docile by turning their own emotions into liabilities. You learn to school your face, to smile just enough, but not too much, to frown when something bad happens, but not too dramatically. Every feeling becomes a performance, every reaction a calculation. You begin to mistrust your instincts. Was that laugh inappropriate? Should I have looked sadder? Should I be happy right now? One girl, desperate for some control, trained herself to blush on cue by pinching her cheeks. Another practiced mirror exercises, smiling in 10 variations, until she found one her governess deemed gracious. One particularly creative boy drew faces on his bedroom wall to mimic happy, polite, concerned. He called it practicing manners, but most children simply learn to go blank. To offer a neutral expression, a polite nod, a safe silence. Not because they had nothing to feel, but because feeling had consequences. You adapt because adaptation is survival, and your governess, ever gentle, ever watchful, writes another quiet note in her leather-bound book. Expression suitably subdued during lessons. No outbursts. Appears obedient. You are becoming exactly what the household wants a child with no visible secrets. Only the tidy veneer of virtue neatly recorded page after page. Back in the nursery, you're handed a toy. But it's not yours to enjoy, it's yours to learn from. The doll wears a pinafore and bonnet always modest, always maternal. The toy soldier stands tall, his face stern, a tiny musket glued to his side. No one asks what stories you want to tell. The stories have already been chosen. In the Victorian world, toys weren't meant to entertain. They were carefully curated tools for training. Every object in the toy chest had a purpose and a lesson. Dolls were mothers in waiting. Soldiers were models of courage and obedience. Even spinning tops and marbles came with quiet expectations. Coordination, patience, order. You receive a sewing kit at age 5, not because you ask for one, but because you're expected to practice industriousness. Boys might get miniature farm sets or postal kits designed to reinforce the roles society would one day assign. Even puzzles, those rare free play objects, were often moralistic, depicting biblical scenes or national heroes. Playtime was more syllabus than sandbox. Some historians frame this as well-meaning preparation. Toys taught essential skills, after all. Others argue it was a form of social conditioning play used not to liberate the imagination, but to box it in. The line between joy and duty was thin and easily crossed, and sometimes it vanished altogether. You once tried to pretend your doll was a pirate queen. The idea delighted you for a moment, but then your nanny corrected the doll's posture, smoothed her skirt, and reminded you that ladies don't sail. You nodded, and the game ended. The pirate was folded away like laundry, replaced by tea and tiny spoons. A few children resisted in clever ways. One boy turned his alphabet blocks into escape routes for a mouse he claimed was hiding in the nursery walls. A girl arranged her dollhouse into a courtroom, staging trials for button thieves and candy conspirators. But most learned early play had boundaries. To step outside them was not charming, it was incorrect. Even gifts came with expectations. A doll might arrive with a diary you were expected to fill in her voice. A toy train came with a map of colonial routes, India, Australia, the Cape. You weren't just playing engineer. You were rehearsing empire. One governess described a child who named his toy lion Rebellion. It was quietly replaced with a bear named Peace. Another reported that a girls' marionette show featured a lady who refused to marry and moved into a treehouse instead. The puppet was later lost. And so, you learn the lesson. You don't choose what the toys say. They speak the language of society, of duty, of the roles already drawn for you. Your job is to listen, to echo. But still at night, you sometimes press your doll's hand and whisper, "Let's run away." You're tucked into bed now, safe beneath the covers. Or so it seems until your mother arrives with a letter. It's addressed to you, but the handwriting isn't hers. It's older, wavering. And it begins. "Dearest sibling, I write to you from heaven." Victorian children sometimes received letters from the dead. Not real ones, of course, but carefully crafted missives written by grieving parents pretending to be departed brothers or sisters. These letters came with lessons. Be kind, obey your elders, say your prayers. They weren't threats exactly, more like moral postcards from the afterlife. One popular etiquette manual even included templates. Tell them you miss them. Tell them you are watching. Remind them to be good so they may join you someday. And so, parents became ghostwriters of virtue. The veil between life and death was pulled just thin enough to let a little instruction through. These bedtime letters were read aloud sometimes in soft candlelight as part of evening routines. The voice was hushed, the tone mournful. "I saw you take the jam from the pantry, one letter noted. That made me very sad. Heaven is a place for honest children." The effect was gentle but chilling. It wasn't a scolding, it was a haunting. Scholars disagree on the motive. Some see this as an outpouring of grief, parents trying to keep lost children present, giving them purpose in the family still living. Others argue it was manipulation, however tender, an emotional pressure placed on already anxious children, cloaked in lays and love. You don't know how to feel, part of you believes. You picture your older brother, whom you never met, sitting on a cloud with a pen and a view. You wonder if he's truly watching. You wonder what happens if you misbehave tomorrow. Some families kept the letters in ornate boxes, reading them on birthdays or anniversaries. Others burned them after reading as a symbolic release. A few children wrote back, tucking their notes under pillows, waiting for replies that never came. One girl saved every letter in a drawer, and later, as an adult, discovered her mother's handwriting matched the ghost's. She didn't feel betrayed, only confused. Had her mother believed it too? Or had they both played along, each for different reasons? In some households, these letters weren't even tied to real children. They were fictions, invented siblings who died nobly of scarlet fever, or fell in service to queen and country. Their voices served a single purpose: to remind the living to behave, to be grateful, to obey. You close your eyes as the candle is blown out. The letter rests beneath your pillow. You can almost hear the voice again, whispering from the folds of parchment, urging you to be better tomorrow. And somehow, you promise. You wake to the sound of your own name, softly spoken, without excitement. It's your birthday, but don't expect a party. In this house, birthdays are not for balloons or cake. They're for reflection, remembrance, a reminder that you are alive, and someone else isn't. At the breakfast table, a small parcel waits for you. It's wrapped in muslin and string, not ribbon. Inside a brooch, tiny, delicate, and old. You recognize the initials engraved on the back. They belong to your sister, the one you never met. This is her memorial token, and now it's your birthday gift. In Victorian families touched by loss, and there were many birthdays, often served a dual purpose, celebrating the living child while commemorating the dead. Instead of sweets or toys, some children received items that had belonged to deceased siblings: a locket, a book of hymns, a handkerchief. These gifts were meant to remind, not distract. You're told to be grateful. She would have wanted you to have it, your mother says. You nod awkwardly. The house feels quieter than usual. No guests arrive. No games are played. Only the ticking of the clock and the faint scent of dust and flowers mark the day's passing. Some children were instructed to spend their birthdays writing letters of thanks to their parents or to God. Others were told to visit a sibling's grave and leave a flower. One etiquette guide from the period suggests that on the natal day, a child should reflect upon the great mercies granted to them and contemplate the duties required in return. That's a lot of pressure when you're 7. Historians continue to debate the emotional purpose of these muted birthdays. Some argue it was a coping mechanism, a way to fold grief into daily life without fanfare. Others suggest it was meant to instill humility, ensuring that joy never turned into pride. A few even frame it as moral insurance, reminding a child how easily they too could vanish. You try to feel thankful. You clutch the brooch. But it's cold in your hand. You think of the cake you once saw in a storybook, its candles flickering like tiny suns. You've never had that. Instead, you get a hymn sung softly by your aunt. Another year is granted thee. Tread humbly on thy way. Some children found ways to celebrate in secret. A whispered happy birthday to themselves in the mirror. A drawing hidden in a book. One girl saved crumbs from breakfast rolls and arranged them into the shape of her age before eating them quickly, just to mark the moment. But most accepted the day as it came, slow, somber, and reverent. The best you could hope for was the gift of not being forgotten, of being remembered for who you are, not just who you replaced. As the sun sets, you pin the brooch to your collar. You're not sure it suits you, but you wear it anyway. Because in this house, birthdays aren't about you. Night falls, and with it comes the one place you'd expect safety, the world of dreams. But even here, the Victorian child is not free. You're told to fear what your mind does when you sleep, to treat dreams not as stories, but as sins waiting to bloom. You mention a dream at breakfast, something harmless. A picnic in the clouds, perhaps, or a talking cat in boots. Your nanny frowns. Foolishness leads to folly, she mutters. That evening, you're handed a blank book. For your dreams, she says, write them down. We'll talk about them in the morning. Dream journals were common tools in some Victorian nurseries, not for creativity, but for confession. Children were expected to log their nighttime wanderings and present them to their caretakers for review. Dreams of flying prideful, dreams of sweets gluttony, dreams of running wild through fields rebellious. Even dreams about laughter might be marked as emotional excess. One manual warned that dreams may reveal the true inclinations of the heart before the mind has yet learned to conceal them. And so, your most private landscapes become public property. Pages are scanned not for meaning, but for moral failings. Scholars remain uncertain about how seriously these dream reports were taken. Some believe they were symbolic exercises aimed at encouraging introspection. Others argue they were control mechanisms designed to monitor even a child's subconscious. There is no agreement but plenty of speculation. You try to comply, you write neatly, you adjust your dreams on paper. In one entry, the monster becomes a friendly dog. In another, the feast becomes a fast. You're not sure if your dreams are changing or just your ability to hide them. One boy, clever with metaphors, began coding his entries. The apple tree whispered to me meant he longed to speak freely. I saw a blackbird in a cage meant he felt trapped. His nanny praised him for his soulful imagery, never realizing the truth she was reading. A girl hid blank pages in her journal, claiming her dreams were forgotten. She said they vanished on waking. Another child began sleeping without a pillow, convinced it caused improper dreams. Imagination, once a child's secret companion, became suspect. You're told that idle minds invite danger, that fantasy is a step away from vice. So you start to fear your dreams. Or worse, you start to wish them away. You lie in bed tonight, eyes closed tightly, hoping for nothing. No castles, no talking animals, no mysterious doors or glowing lakes, just blackness, just obedience. And if a dream slips through soft, wild, impossible, you promise not to remember it. You'll let it melt with morning light, unspoken and unrecorded, because in this world even your sleep isn't truly yours. You drift into sleep at last, or something close to it. The room is quiet, but never truly dark. Candlelight flickers from the hallway, and heavy velvet curtains cast shifting shadows across the floor. You lie beneath layers of wool and cotton, cocooned more by custom than by comfort. This is how Victorian children learn to sleep by ghostlight. The nursery feels both safe and strange. Portraits of deceased relatives line the walls, their faces frozen in faded oils. One, a boy your age, stares just above the doorframe. Another shows a woman you're told is mother's first cousin, lost to fever. No one mentions her name anymore, but her eyes still watch from the frame. These mourning portraits weren't rare. Victorian families often hung images of the dead among the living, especially in children's rooms. Some portraits were posthumous, painted from memory, or photographs taken after death. To modern eyes, this might seem grim, but in a world where death visited often and unannounced, remembrance was a form of stability. Children were taught to sleep beside reminders of loss as a normal part of life. The curtains, too, carry their own weight. Made of thick damask or brocade, they're meant to block drafts and dampen noise. But they also create silhouettes, twisting, shifting forms that dance when a breeze sneaks in. Some children imagine monsters there. Others assign them names, stories, personalities. One girl believed her curtain shadow was a guardian who kept nightmares away unless she misbehaved. Psychologists today still puzzle over the effects of these settings. Did they nurture strength, teaching children to live with fear? Or did they seed anxiety, embedding dread in the very act of falling asleep? There's no consensus, only the lingering echo of quiet bedtime rituals. In wealthier homes, a night candle might burn low in a tall glass lamp, its flame dimmed with a perforated lid. The patterns cast on the ceiling became your nightly wallpaper. In poorer homes, children fell asleep to the sounds of adult footsteps creaking floors and the distant clatter of coal carts outside. Either way, you didn't sleep alone. You slept with history. And then there were the sounds. A clock ticking in the hallway, the faint drip of water from a pipe, the occasional whisper from another room. These weren't interruptions, they were companions, markers of presence, proof that the house with all its silence still breathed. Some children grew fond of these elements. One boy said he could only fall asleep if he counted all the curtain folds first. A girl believed the portrait on her wall smiled when she'd had a good day. Whether this was comfort or coping, no one asked. It was simply part of the night. You close your eyes now. The candle hums, the shadows stretch, the velvet curtains rustle softly as if whispering lullabies from another world. But behind those rustling curtains and flickering lamps, someone else was always awake, quiet, alert, and already shaping the rhythms of tomorrow. You can smell the starch before you see her. A crispness in the air, clean linen lavender soap, and the faint singe of ironed skirts. The nanny arrives early before the governess, before the cook. She walks through the servants' entrance, past the scullery, up the back stairs, and into a world where she knows the temperature of every child's tea and the rhythm of every tantrum. By the time the master of the house takes his second sip of coffee, she's already managed 3 emotional crises, 1 mismatched sock, and a marmalade incident involving a stuffed rabbit. Victorian nannies weren't just caretakers, they were emotional engineers. Beneath layers of societal hierarchy and moral instruction, they calibrated the daily lives of children like quiet conductors. Some were hired with glowing references. Others were brought in after a family scandal required a softer hand. Their presence was often constant yet invisible. They weren't supposed to influence, only implement. But of course, they did both. Behind the lace curtains and ticking clocks, many nannies kept tiny notebooks. Hidden under mattresses or tucked between hymnals, these diaries chronicled everything from household gossip to a child's first lie. One such journal describes a girl named Annabelle who refused to eat pudding unless her spoon had a bow tied around it. Another details the precise volume at which Master Edgar would pretend to cry when trying to avoid piano lessons. Trivial, maybe. But within those lines lies the invisible architecture of Victorian childhood. Some scholars still debate the extent of these women's influence. Were they passive enforcers of their employer's will, or subtle molders of future adults? The records are scattered, the voices secondhand. And yet, in the curl of a child's handwriting or the preserved sketch of a nanny's cap, traces remain. A quirky detail emerges from one set of letters, a nanny who developed her own emotional weather chart. Red ribbon for tantrums, blue for calm, yellow for particularly charming behavior. She'd hang the day's color near the nursery door as a quiet warning or celebration for the parents. Today, historians are only beginning to appreciate these journals not just as domestic relics, but as anthropological gold. They reveal a kind of microhistory, ordinary moments layered with meaning, power, and affection. They also hint at something more haunting, how entire generations were shaped, not by public figures, but by women whose names rarely made it onto the family tree. The click of a latch, the hush of polished boots on stair runners. Upstairs, the household buzzes with breakfast chatter and the clink of silver spoons. But in the schoolroom, the governess is already stationed straight-backed, composed, halfway through a cold cup of tea. She occupies a peculiar limbo, not quite servant, not quite family, not quite free, just governess. You enter her world gently noticing how she avoids eye contact with the butler, yet accepts tea from the mistress without a word. She is neither bowed to nor spoken over. In many Victorian homes, the governess held the role of quiet authority, a living paradox. She was educated often from a good family, brought low by fortune, and tasked with molding the minds of future gentlemen and ladies. But socially, she was invisible, expected to dine alone, speak only when necessary, and avoid both alliances with staff and over-familiarity with children. This ambiguous status defined her power everywhere and nowhere. She knew the children's moods better than their parents did. She corrected grammar, introduced poetry, explained foreign wars with map pins. And yet no one invited her to weddings or whispered family news in her presence. One governess, writing in a letter that was never meant to be seen outside her sister's hands, described herself as a fixture like the grandfather clock, trusted, ticked at, and utterly alone. Scholars continue to debate whether this role gave women more autonomy or less. Was it a rare opportunity for independence, income, and education, or a gilded cage with no keys? Some argue that governesses used their ambiguous place to influence children's values more than any sermon could. Others suggest that being neither servant nor equal meant their influence dissolved as soon as their backs were turned. You imagine one such governess, Miss Eleanor, perhaps reading aloud by lamplight while a storm blusters outside, her voice steady through tales of Roman conquest or Flemish painters, even as thunder rattles the panes. She pauses only when little Florence yawns, then resumes without comment, holding the rhythm like a metronome. She doesn't touch the child. That would be too intimate. But the warmth in her voice just there between the lines of a story about Julius Caesar offers more comfort than a woolen blanket ever could. Yet this emotional labor rarely earned recognition. If the child grew up kind or clever, credit was given to lineage. If spoiled or dull, blame went to the governess. She was a mirror that absorbed flaws without reflecting them back. Even in literature, governesses were either angels or shadows, never protagonists. A curious side note, some governesses formed covert alliances with nannies. In private, they traded notes on which child needed reassurance, who feared the dark, or whose mother rarely visited the nursery. This whispered collaboration softened otherwise rigid household rules. They were in a quiet way resistance. Today their influence is buried beneath layers of etiquette and dust. But if you listen closely to Victorian letters or skim the margins of old lesson books, you might still find traces of their presence, ink faded but not forgotten. The kitchen smells linger faintly upstairs, burnt toast, boiled eggs, a ghost of smoked kippers. But in the nursery, food isn't just nourishment, it's discipline. You watch as the governess lays out breakfast like a ritual toast, triangles aligned jam, precisely dabbed porridge, neither too thick nor too thin. Everything has meaning, everything a message. In Victorian nurseries, meals were tools of emotional training, not just about teaching table manners, but about controlling appetite, expression, and desire. A child who asked for seconds too eagerly might be scolded for gluttony. One who refused peas could be labeled disobedient. The size of a portion, the timing of a treat, even the temperature of milk, all were calibrated like moral experiments. You notice a boy may be sick staring down a bowl of stewed prunes. He makes no move to eat. The governess does not raise her voice. Instead, she offers a story about a Roman soldier who ate sour figs before battle. It's gentle manipulation cloaked in myth. The child takes a bite. Historians now believe this kind of structured feeding was more than household routine. It was early food psychology. The Victorians didn't have that term, of course, but they practiced it anyway. One governess's journal describes the strawberry test, in which a particularly spoiled child was offered a single ripe berry, then asked to wait 10 minutes before eating. If she succeeded, she earned 2. If not, she received none. Pavlovian, perhaps. Passive-aggressive, definitely. Some scholars see this as moral conditioning, a reflection of Victorian ideals of restraint, piety, and class control. Others argue It taught children to suppress instincts, fostering lifelong anxieties around food and desire. The truth likely lies somewhere between the two. But there were quirky details too. A few governesses developed playful rituals to soften the severity. One would cut toast into animal shapes and let children rescue each piece from a pretend jungle. Another kept a secret drawer of candied violets offered only when a child showed unexpected bravery or kindness. These gentle indulgences never made it into household reports, but they mattered. There's also the matter of the dining silence. Many Victorian nurseries enforced strict quiet during meals. No chatter, no laughter, no humming. Children were expected to chew thoughtfully, as if digesting more than food, perhaps obedience, perhaps shame. One journal entry captures a rare defiance, a nanny who, when left alone with the children, one evening played a silent game of guess the pudding by tapping codes under the table. In these rituals, food became a language, each bite a word, each empty plate a sentence. And like any language, it could comfort or command, liberate or control. The children learned to read their nanny's eyebrows as clearly as a menu. One frown could mean no jam for a week. Today, the legacy of these mealtime dramas still echoes. Not in school cafeterias, but in the quiet guilt some adults feel when reaching for a second biscuit, or the warm memory of toast cut like elephants. You might think love would be easy to offer a child, but Victorian nannies were warned otherwise. Love too freely given was considered dangerous. Favoritism could unbalance the household, confuse class boundaries, and most dreadfully of all, soften discipline. So, the rule was clear. Do not show affection, not too much, not too often, not even if your heart begged you to. And yet, you step into the nursery on a quiet afternoon and notice something. A worn shawl wrapped twice around one child's shoulders, even though the room is warm. A lullaby hummed a little longer for just one pair of sleepy eyes. A note in a diary. I gave her hand a quick squeeze when no one was looking. These moments didn't appear in the manuals. They lived in the shadows of duty. Many nannies confessed years later in journals and letters to falling in love with the children they cared for. Not romantic love, of course, but something perhaps deeper. A love sharpened by responsibility, sacrifice, and hours upon hours of mundane intimacy. Wiping noses, tying boots, soothing nightmares. Love folded neatly inside the structure of routine. The fear of favoritism wasn't unfounded. One nanny dismissed abruptly, later discovered it was because the youngest child cried more at her departure than at his mother's absence. The scandal wasn't the child's sorrow, it was the social imbalance it revealed. Historians remain divided on how widespread such attachments were. Some argue they were inevitable given the intensity and duration of the role. Others suggest they were exceptions, not the rule fleeting affections mistaken for deeper bonds. And yet the journals tell another story. Entries like, "He reached for my hand again today," or "She waited at the window until I returned," appear too often to be accidents. A quirky little pattern emerges in several surviving nanny diaries' nicknames. Not the ones given by the children, but secret names the nannies assigned to each child in their private writings. The philosopher, the storm cloud Miss Buttons. These names weren't just cute, they were emotional codes. They marked closeness, familiarity, and sometimes quiet grief. Because showing too much affection could cost a nanny her position, many developed subtle ways of expressing care. A ribbon tied in a child's favorite color. A favorite story read twice. A glance held just a moment longer than necessary. Small rebellions of tenderness hidden in plain sight. In some cases, children sensed the risk. One grown woman recalled in her own memoir how she would pretend to fall asleep quickly, just so her nanny could kiss her forehead in secret without fear of being caught. In the end, this tension between duty and devotion became a defining feature of nanny life. They had to be present but restrained, tender but professional. They raised generations of Victorian children, and in doing so, left traces not just in scrapbooks or sketches, but in habits, phrases, and stories that those children carried long into adulthood. Beneath the surface of every Victorian nursery lay another rule book, one that spoke not of feeding schedules or bedtime routines, but of touch. Soft, strict, and nearly invisible, the rules about physical affection guided every gesture. A hand on the shoulder questionable, a pat on the head allowed maybe, a hug absolutely not unless the house was on fire or the child was dying, and even then think twice. You enter the room just as a toddler trips over a wooden block. The fall isn't serious, just a small bump and a startled cry. The nanny freezes. Instincts and instruction wage war behind her eyes. She kneels, checks the child's elbow, but does not embrace. Instead, she offers a handkerchief and a distracted mention of bravery. Her voice is calm, her hands remain still, and yet the child stops crying. Touch was a regulated currency in Victorian households, and nannies were expected to spend it sparingly. Manuals advised against overfamiliar gestures and warned that excessive warmth could lead to blurred lines. Physical affection, it was said, could undermine authority, create dependency, or worse, spark rumors among the staff. The ideal nanny was emotionally available but physically distant, a walking paradox in petticoats. Some scholars see this as a form of professional decorum, akin to the stiff collars worn by footmen or the glove etiquette of the upper class. Others argue it was cruelty wrapped in the language of propriety. How do you comfort a sobbing child without a cuddle? How do you build trust with only words and wool blankets and diaries? Nannies sometimes recorded moments when they broke the rules. A quick hand squeeze during a thunderstorm. A child clinging during an illness. One journal tells of a girl who asked for a goodnight kiss like the ones in books. The nanny gave her a soft pat on the back instead, then wept afterward in the linen cupboard. A curious side story. One household introduced a system of coded approval. Children could earn tokens for good behavior, and those tokens could be exchanged not for sweets or toys, but for comfort time. 5 tokens might earn 5 minutes of lap sitting during story hour. It was a system both tender and transactional, oddly Victorian in its logic. Because of these restrictions, nannies grew skilled in non-touch affection. The placement of a child's slippers by the fire, a scarf warmed in secret before being wrapped around small shoulders. Affection became performance art, seen in actions never skin. Children, perceptive as ever, learned to interpret these gestures fluently. Even so, the emotional toll was real. One retired nanny wrote in a letter that her greatest regret was not kissing the boy goodbye the day he left for boarding school. She watched from the upstairs window, she said, and waved with one gloved hand. And so, the rules about touch shaped not only the behavior of Victorian nannies, but also the emotional blueprint of the children they raised. Intimacy became something to be earned, measured and remembered, not freely given. Sometimes the silence told more than the chatter. A letter left on the nursery dresser carelessly folded, the seal half broken, the envelope open just enough. You imagine the nanny glancing both ways, then reading just a line or two, before slipping it back into place. Victorian nannies were expected to be invisible, but that didn't stop them from seeing everything. In the strict hierarchy of Victorian homes, letters were sacred, intended only for their addressed eyes. But when families treated the nursery as an extension of the drawing room, correspondence often drifted into nanny territory. Some nannies entrusted with errands or tidying handled the mail directly. Others simply stumbled upon open letters while dusting or rearranging the bookshelf. And in more than a few cases, curiosity won. You find one such diary entry, a note from Lady A misaddressed. Curious contents. Something about debts in Paris. Another writes, read mistress's letter by mistake. Sir is not where he claims to be. The tone is calm, almost bored. But between the lines, judgment brews like a strong pot of oversteeped tea. Scholars continue to debate how intentional these intrusions were. Some suggest nannies were merely caught in the paper trail of domestic life. Others believe they carefully curated their knowledge, reading selectively, noting what mattered, ignoring the rest. Either way, many developed a silent archive of secrets, mistresses' affairs, gambling habits, hints of illnesses kept hidden from the staff. A quirky example emerges from one household's records, a nanny who kept a running tally in her journal of how often the red ink appeared in family correspondence. She believed it signaled financial trouble. Every time red ink showed up, a new austerity measure followed fewer sweets canceled outings, or once the abrupt sale of a pony. Some nannies even used these secret readings as a kind of emotional barometer. If a letter hinted at tension between husband and wife, the nanny might prepare for outbursts or sulks in the nursery. If gossip about another family surfaced, she might tighten discipline, anticipating heightened scrutiny from above. And yet, none of this power could be openly acknowledged. Nannies were expected to act as though they heard nothing, saw nothing, read nothing. Discretion was their armor. One journal reads, "They think me deaf." It is safer that way. This dual-role caretaker and quiet observer gave some nannies a kind of invisible authority. Not over the household, perhaps, but over its rhythm, its moods, its unsaid truths. They understood who was likely to visit, when tensions might flare, which alliances were shifting behind velvet curtains. And so, the letters they were never meant to read became a source of silent influence. They didn't intervene. They didn't gossip. They simply knew and carried that knowledge like a hidden spool of thread, weaving it into their daily routines without ever being noticed. The lamp is dim. The fire is down to embers. Outside, gaslights flicker through the window pane as fog curls around the garden hedges. And inside the nursery, the real work begins bedtime. It's not just about brushing teeth or folding blankets. It's a ritual, a carefully choreographed performance where every story sigh and shadow plays its part. You settle beside a low cot as the nanny opens a well-worn book. Her voice is soft rhythm, steady as she begins a tale about a brave mouse or a selfish prince. But she doesn't read every word. Not quite. You notice small edits, less punishment, more forgiveness. A villain softened, a dragon spared. Bedtime in this household isn't just storytelling, it's subtle resistance. Victorian manuals prescribed precise routines for putting children to bed. Moral tales were encouraged ideally, ones that reinforced obedience, humility, or industriousness. Ghost stories were discouraged unless they promoted caution or underscored the consequences of lying. Even the order of events was structured: bath prayer, story, lights out. But within these rules, nannies found room to improvise. Some confessed in journals to inventing characters who resembled the children themselves, turning lessons into playful mirrors. Others admitted to replacing stern endings with gentler ones, especially after a difficult day. Bedtime became a battleground between doctrine and instinct. Some scholars argue these altered stories were a form of oral tradition passed down through quiet rebellion. Because they weren't written down, they slipped through historical records, lost in the folds of nightcaps and candlelight. Others believe they were simply survival tactics, ways for nannies to preserve affection and connection in a job that rarely allowed either. A curious diary entry describes a nanny who invented an entire moon kingdom visited nightly by the same set of characters. The children begged for updates each evening. Over time, she realized she'd created an entire parallel world, one where the rules were hers alone. Quirky bedtime traditions abounded. One governess played a game called dream keys, where each child received an imaginary key to lock away a bad thought before sleep. Another used hand shadows on the wall to shoo away nightmares. These rituals rarely made it into the official schedule, but were fiercely remembered by children well into adulthood. Bedtime also allowed nannies brief moments of unguarded affection, a whispered joke, a blanket tucked tighter than necessary. A story paused mid-sentence just to say goodnight. One journal notes, "I told him the prince made peace, not war. He smiled in his sleep." And of course, bedtime was when the house was quietest. Secrets could be whispered without fear of being overheard. Emotions softened by drowsiness could surface in safe, sleepy ways. It was during these moments that bonds were forged, not through grand gestures, but in the hush between candle snuffing and the closing of a door. Today, historians study Victorian bedtime practices with increasing interest, not for the tales themselves, but for what they reveal about power, empathy, and the quiet defiance of women who turn bedtime into a soft revolution. The candle sputters once before settling into a low, steady glow. On the walls, shadows begin their nightly dance, stretching long fingers across bookshelves and nursery rugs. And the governess watches not with fear, but fascination. To her, these shadows aren't threats, they're data, patterns, clues about the child's mind. Some Victorian governesses kept private notes, not just about arithmetic scores or penmanship, but about how children reacted to light and shadow at bedtime. One journal records that a child named Toby refused to sleep if the candle was too close to the door. Another noticed that when shadows fell across a beloved toy elephant, the child cried more often. These weren't superstitions. They were early experiments in what we now call sensory psychology. You sit quietly observing as the nanny adjusts the candle's position, a subtle move. The flickering light now throws the shadow to the far side of the room, away from the bed. The child exhales, and sleep creeps closer. Some scholars still debate whether these practices were intentional observations or accidental patterns. Were governesses quietly conducting proto-scientific experiments, or were they simply trying anything to make bedtime smoother? Regardless, the records are remarkably consistent. Multiple sources mention using shadows as a kind of behavior guide, softer light for anxious children, firmer pools of darkness for the rowdy. A quirky example, one governess created shadow animals to test emotional responses. A bunny made with fingers brought comfort. A bird's silhouette startled one child into tears. After that, she used the bird only when discipline was needed. Soft psychology cast on wallpaper. There's another layer here. Victorian homes were dimly lit compared to modern standards. Gaslight was expensive, and most nurseries relied on candles or oil lamps. Shadows weren't accidental. They were ever-present companions. A child's fear or fascination with them offered a unique window into their temperament. Some nannies used this to their advantage. One journal describes a game called Light Riders, in which children imagine tiny knights galloping on shadows, protecting them through the night. Another simply noted, "I move the candle lower. He sleeps faster." Not quite a peer-reviewed study, but effective nonetheless. These small adjustments, often unspoken, shape the child's emotional landscape. Shadow management became part of bedtime strategy layered between lullabies and moral fables. And though it went undocumented in official manuals, its effects lingered in memory. One adult recalling his childhood wrote, "I don't remember the stories she told, only how she made the dark feel safe." Today, those quiet candlelit observations offer a rare glimpse into the emotional intelligence of Victorian nannies. They weren't just following routines. They were intuiting moods, decoding reactions, and adapting the environment accordingly. It was a science of feeling practiced long before psychology took interest. And perhaps that's the strangest part. In a society obsessed with rigidity and order, some of its most profound emotional insights came not from doctors or philosophers, but from women moving candles half an inch to the left, so a child could fall asleep without fear. A cough in the night, soft at first, then sharper, followed by the rustle of blankets and the quick tap of feet across cold floorboards. The nanny is already awake, she always is. Illness changes everything. The nursery becomes a sick room, and in that moment, she becomes something else entirely. In Victorian households, when a child fell ill, the nanny's role shifted from routine caretaker to de facto nurse comforter and crisis manager. Doctors might be summoned, yes, but only after the nanny had assessed the situation, sponged a brow-brewed tea, and whispered a prayer. In the absence of modern medicine, instinct ruled, and the instinct was always stay close. You picture her now, seated beside a child's bed, rubbing a salve made of goose fat and mustard onto a tiny chest. Not because it works, though, sometimes it did, but because it's what her grandmother taught her. Folk remedies were passed down like recipes whispered from midwives to maids to nannies. A little lavender under the pillow, onion slices in socks, mulled wine for fevers. Every household had its own blend of faith-fear and fragrant steam. But sometimes it wasn't real illness at all. One diary notes, "He has no fever, only sorrow." The child was sent home from school after a bully's taunt. The nanny wrapped him in an extra quilt and declared him too unwell for lessons. Other entries hint at faked sickness. Sniffles, exaggerated coughs timed just so. Not for attention necessarily, but for connection. A way to summon closeness that was otherwise rationed. Some scholars argue this blur between care and control was problematic. By managing both the illness and the response to it, nannies held enormous emotional power. Others suggest it was an act of compassion, allowing children the space to express feelings in physical form when no other outlet existed. Both views, it seems, have their truths. Quirky sickroom strategies surface in letters and notes. One governess created a potion drawer filled with colored waters and flavorless tinctures labeled with grand titles: Dragon's Breath, Serpent's Sigh, Moonlight Elixir. The children believed in them fiercely. Another nanny used a worn deck of cards to tell gentle fortunes, promising that recovery was only 2 kings away. And then there were the prayers, whispered, muttered, or mouthed silently beside a child's bed. Some came from official hymnals, others were entirely improvised. "Let her fever break like morning light," one nanny wrote in the margins of her journal. "Let him wake dry-browed and hungry for toast." These moments, half clinical, half magical, define the emotional undercurrent of Victorian nursery life. They weren't sanitized or sentimentalized. They were messy, intimate, and filled with uncertainty. A fever might be just a fever, or it might be a quiet plea to not be sent away to school so soon. In those shadowed hours with the house asleep, and only the wind outside to bear witness a nanny's presence became the one constant. Not praised, not documented, but remembered. Always remembered. The ribbon was pink. Not bright, not flashy, just a soft, worn pink, tied carefully each morning into a child's curls. You wouldn't think something so small could matter, but that day the ribbon was cut, not misplaced, not lost. Cut deliberately with sewing scissors. And afterward the nanny wrote, "I've never forgiven myself." Victorian punishments were supposed to be orderly charts, deductions revoked privileges. But emotions didn't always follow rules. Sometimes the discipline stung longer than intended, and sometimes the nanny regretted it more than the child did. You see a girl frozen in surprise as the ribbon drops. The nanny is silent. It's not the worst punishment in the household, not even close, but something changes in the air, a flicker of betrayal, a sudden distance. In her journal that night, the nanny writes only one line. "She wouldn't look at me during story hour. Many nanny journals describe punishments carried out with precision and ached over afterward. Standing a child in the corner until dusk, removing a beloved toy for a week, or, in one case, making a child copy a moral essay 50 times. He spelled obedience wrong on every page the governess noted, and I didn't correct him. Whether from lingering anger or quiet mercy, she never says. Some historians view these accounts as evidence of emotional strain, nannies walking a tightrope between strictness and sorrow. Others suggest the regret was performative, a way of soothing one's own conscience in a job that offered little space for doubt. But either way, the pattern repeats punishment, given guilt, recorded. A curious story emerges from one manor. A governess punished a boy by forbidding him from playing the piano, a skill he loved and rarely shared. After a week, she heard him playing faint notes on a toy xylophone in secret. She didn't intervene. Instead, she slipped the piano key back into his drawer and never mentioned it again. Quirky punishments also appear in household notes. A nanny once enforced silent breakfast for a particularly talkative child, only to join him in exaggerated pantomime until they both dissolved in laughter. Another described the pebble jar, where each misdeed meant adding a pebble to a glass. Once full, a privilege was lost. But one night, the jar mysteriously emptied. Sometimes the discipline matched expectations. Other times it wavered. A child who broke a vase might be yelled at one day, forgiven the next. Inconsistency bred confusion for child and nanny alike. And when discipline was given not out of care but out of exhaustion or humiliation, it lingered like a bruise. Some entries feel almost confessional. I made her stand by the wall too long. She did not cry, but I did. Or I scolded him before asking what happened. I think he lied just to end it. And in these lines, the complexity of the nanny's role becomes clear. Not just a disciplinarian, but a moral navigator charting the spaces between justice and cruelty, between structure and softness. The morning routine began with laces. Long, stiff, stubborn corset strings tugged tight across tender ribs. The nanny kneeling behind a girl not much older than 8 pulled with practiced hands. The child didn't wince. She was used to it. Every day a little tighter. Every day a little closer to womanhood. Victorian childhood was not soft, especially for girls. Long before petticoats and posture lessons, many were introduced to the training corset, a garment designed not just to shape the body, but the will. And it was the nanny who wielded the laces. You watch her now, fingers deftly threading through eyelets, murmuring reminders about elegance and breath control. Stand tall, my dove. Beauty takes stillness. For some children, it was ritual. For others, daily dread. The morning tug was more than physical. It set the tone for the day. Medical historians still argue about the long-term effects. Did these corsets truly deform ribs and restrict organ growth, or are the worst tales exaggerated? Some evidence suggests permanent changes. Others point to photographs of women who wore them with no apparent harm. But few studies consider the emotional weight, how it felt to be told again and again that shrinking made you proper. The nanny's own feelings were rarely recorded. Did she believe in the corset's purpose or simply follow instructions, same as brushing hair or serving toast? One diary hints at quiet dissent. I loosened the stays when Madame wasn't looking. She looked relieved. Said nothing. Quirky variations emerge from household notes. One nanny developed a reward system. If the girl endured 3 days of full lacing without complaint, she could skip it on Sunday. Another played a game statue time, where the child posed in a corseted stance and earned compliments based on her stillness. Sugar-coated compliance, perhaps. But also a coping strategy. Some nannies whispered encouragements as they tied. You're braver than the queen. Just one more pull. Others said nothing at all. Silence, like the corset itself, became part of the uniform. Children reacted in different ways. One girl wrote years later that the tightness made her feel special and grown. Another recalled panic attacks she didn't understand until adulthood. And a few those lucky enough to have indulgent caretakers escape the ritual, entirely trading structure for freedom, if only for a summer. It wasn't just about fashion. Corsets were symbols of restraint, readiness, and social ambition. To wear one well meant you were on the right path. And to resist childish, wild, improper. Nannies walked the line between enforcement and empathy, applying pressure while trying not to break what was inside. Today those corset strings hang in museums neat and lifeless, but once they were instruments of transformation, and the women who tied them, quiet kneeling, rarely thanked, held more power than they ever admitted. Not just over inches and silhouettes, but over the confidence, breath, and posture of a generation. The cupboard creaked ominously, its little brass key dangling from a hook just out of reach. To the children, it was both treasure chest and tribunal. Behind its heavy oak doors lay the toy kingdom wooden animals, cloth dolls, tin soldiers, puzzles with missing pieces. And every item inside was locked away by decree of the nanny. In many Victorian nurseries, toys were not scattered across floors or tossed into baskets. They were stored in what came to be known as the toy cupboard, an imposing cabinet that served less as a storage solution and more as a moral ledger. Access to its contents depended on behavior, effort, and mood. You picture a boy pressing his ear to the door, whispering to the bear he hoped to earn back. Or a girl staring down the key, as if it might float into her hand on kindness alone. The cupboard didn't just hold toys, it held judgment. Each week the nanny evaluated. Had they listened, completed lessons, avoided fibs. Depending on the outcome, toys might be withheld, rotated, or offered freely. One nanny's notebook reads, "Margaret earned the doll's bonnet again. Excellent penmanship. George has lost the spinning top. Insolent at breakfast." Historians remain divided about the ethics of this system. Some describe it as clever incentive, a way to instill values through delayed gratification. Others argue it bordered on manipulation, tying emotional comfort to moral performance. Either way, the toy cupboard became a theater of consequence. A curious quirk, some nannies anthropomorphized the toys. One wrote stories in which the toys themselves voted on whether to be played with. Another gave the toys sick days, claiming the stuffed cat had a cold and needed rest, conveniently during times of punishment. It softened the blow, but also blurred the lines between object and lesson. And then there was the matter of fairness. Did all children face the same rules? Often no. Eldest sons received leniency. Daughters were judged more harshly. Younger siblings inherited both hand-me-downs and expectations. The nanny's role then became one of balancing injustice with consistency, or, at the very least, maintaining the illusion of both. Some entries show compassion in unlikely places. "She wept for the soldier," one nanny wrote, "so I returned him." Early said he missed her. Another allowed a punished child to choose one toy to keep for moral support. Small mercies tucked into rigid systems. The cupboard also served as a psychological space. Children projected hopes onto it, imagined its contents as rewards waiting just beyond reach. One boy reportedly dreamed of the cupboard unlocking itself in the night and the toys staging a jailbreak. The nanny wrote, "I pretended to find the door ajar next morning. He was delighted. I said nothing." Today, few such cupboards survive, but the idea that pleasure must be earned, that comfort must follow compliance, echoes in subtler ways. And behind it all stood the nanny keeper of keys and conscience, deciding each day what joy would be granted and what would be locked away. It begins with a sniffle, a trembling lip, the slow bloom of moisture in the corner of an eye. A child on the verge of tears hesitates. The nanny notices but does not rush. In the Victorian nursery, crying was not just a moment of emotion. It was a test of character, of control, and above all, of propriety. You watch as she kneels not to console, but to instruct. "Chin up," she says softly, almost kindly. "You're braver than that." The child nods, blinking furiously. The tear never falls. Victory in Victorian terms. The era's child-rearing philosophies were steeped in restraint. Emotional outbursts, especially crying, were seen as weaknesses to be corrected. Boys were expected to be stoic, girls modestly silent, but children cry as they always have. And so nannies developed tactics to either redirect the tears or suppress them entirely. Some use shame. Do you think the queen would cry over spilled ink? Others appealed to pride. You're nearly grown. Grown children don't cry over dolls. One governess wrote that she had a special handkerchief labeled emergency, which she would dramatically unfold only for the most noble sobs. Scholars continue to debate whether these approaches were protective, preparing children for a harsh world, or repressive, shaping adults who feared their own feelings. Perhaps both are true. Some children thrived under this structure. Others simply learned to cry where no one could see. Quirky exceptions pop up in the margins. One nanny, upon noticing a child weeping quietly under a blanket, declared it a private rainstorm and allowed it without reprimand. Another encouraged crying only in designated places: the garden bench, the linen closet. One particularly creative solution: a crying clock where children could book a time for tears. By the time their turn arrived, the need had often passed. Nannies, for their part, had to conceal their own emotions, too. No tears when dismissed, no trembling when a child fell ill. A journal entry reads, "I wept only once this year behind the coal scuttle." The cook pretended not to see. Some nannies tried to balance the rules with empathy. They couldn't hug, couldn't openly soothe, but they could hum a lullaby a little longer, or look away discreetly when a child broke. One wrote, "I let him cry into his pillow." Better there than in shame. Over time, these rituals of restraint shaped more than just nursery behavior. They molded identities. Children learned that to be loved was to be quiet. That strength meant swallowing sadness, and that the only acceptable tear was the one no one noticed. But still, in hidden places beneath blankets, behind wardrobes, inside folded towels, tears fell. Not often, not loudly, but enough to water something deeper than obedience. A longing to be seen, perhaps, or simply the human need to be allowed to feel. And the nanny, whether she acknowledged it aloud or not, often felt it too. Not in lectures or rules, but in the weight of a dry-eyed child staring just a little too hard at the floor. A crinkle of paper, the faint rustle of sweets hidden in an apron pocket. Sometimes defiance didn't roar. It whispered. In the rigid world of Victorian childcare, not every rule was followed. Some nannies chose rebellion. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, deliberate acts of kindness that softened the edges of a stern world. You peek into a nursery where the day's schedule has slipped slightly. A bedtime song lingers longer than allowed. A punishment mentioned that morning has mysteriously been forgotten. The nanny smiles but says nothing. She has not lost track. She has made a choice. These quiet acts of defiance weren't about overturning systems. They were about carving moments of humanity within them. A smuggled toffee, an unsanctioned walk in the garden, a bedtime story that didn't contain a single moral lesson. Actions small enough to go unnoticed, yet big enough to be remembered. Historians often overlook these moments, focusing instead on structure and supervision. But journals hint at these tender rebellions. One nanny wrote, "They had no pudding. I gave them apples with sugar and called it medicine." Another scribbled, "I let them run through the mud." told Madam it was geography practice. Some scholars argue these actions undermined authority. Others see them as survival tactics, small gestures to maintain emotional connection in an environment that discouraged it. One thing is clear: these acts weren't careless, they were calculated. The line between leniency and liability was thin, and crossing it came with risk. A curious entry from a governess reveals her system of secret justice. When a child had suffered unfair discipline from a parent, she would forget to enforce the next punishment. The scale must balance, she wrote, even if silently. Another nanny described a routine she called the bonus hour, a sliver of time between scheduled chores and bedtime where children were allowed to be aimless. No Latin, no posture, no etiquette drills. Just 20 minutes of forts made from pillows and dreams whispered into stuffed animals. She never recorded it in her official notes. Quirky rebellions came in many forms. One governess drew tiny smiling faces in the margins of dull grammar lessons. Another taught children to sew, using scraps from the cook's apron, creating mismatched dolls they named after each other. These weren't grand gestures. They were reminders that life existed outside of structure, and sometimes the children knew. A boy once asked, "Are you allowed to be nice today?" The nanny replied only for 5 minutes. Make it count. Years later, he would remember that moment more vividly than any lecture or lesson. These small insurrections did not change the system. They did not challenge hierarchy or rewrite nursery law. But they created a pocket of warmth, a space where affection, creativity, and empathy could exist, if only briefly. In the quiet war between order and care, the Victorian nanny's rebellion was rarely loud. It was sugar-dusted lullaby, wrapped and smuggled in the seams of a dull Tuesday. The hallway echoes in a different way now. Less laughter, fewer footsteps. The nursery is quiet, the toy cupboard shut for good. The child, no longer a child, has gone to school, or perhaps been introduced to society. And the nanny, she packs her things in silence. This was always how it ended. Victorian nannies, after years of constant presence, were expected to vanish gracefully. No farewell dinners, no long speeches. Their role was transitional by design, important yet impermanent. Once the child no longer needed them, they were dismissed with a handshake and perhaps a final week's pay. You step into the nursery one last time. The curtains are drawn. A favorite book remains on the shelf, tucked inside a note in the nanny's handwriting. Not a farewell, just a line from a bedtime story they used to share. It is both everything and not enough. Few records describe what happened to these women afterward. Some found new posts, others returned home, often unmarried, often changed. A handful married late in life, sometimes to widowers, sometimes to other servants. Many never heard from their children again. Some burned their journals, unwilling to leave behind a paper trail. Others sent a final gift, a handkerchief embroidered with initials, a pressed flower from a garden they once tended together. Gestures small enough to be missed, but unmistakable once found. Historians disagree on whether these endings were traumatic or simply practical. One school argues that the emotional rupture left scars that nannies suffered from unacknowledged grief. Another insists they knew the terms from the start, contractual professional brief. But again, the journals say more. One wrote, "I saw her on the street last winter. She did not recognize me, or pretended not to. I waved anyway." Another entry, "He's taller now. I imagine he still slouches when nervous." Quirky post-nursery traditions included leaving behind small signs, marks carved under a windowsill, initials sewn into the lining of a pillow. One nanny painted a tiny blue star beneath the cradle's footboard, so she'd know someone watched over her. The diary reads, "Even when I'm gone," and sometimes the bond outlasted the roll. A rare few received letters years later, written in adult hands, but with the same looping script they once taught. Do you remember when we pretended the floor was lava? One read, I still do sometimes. But more often the silence held. The child moved on. The nanny disappeared into the background of their memory, fondly perhaps, but vaguely. Like the smell of a favorite soap or the sound of a bedtime song without words. So the nanny folded her uniform one last time, tied her bonnet, and closed the door behind her. The home remained, but her presence faded like sunlight on wallpaper. No portrait on the wall, no name in the family tree. Just stories told in passing we had a nurse once, and perhaps a fleeting warmth no one could quite trace. And now the nursery is still. The slippers rest beneath the bed. The toys are asleep behind cupboard doors. The faint scent of lavender and starch lingers in the air like a memory you can almost touch. You've walked through a world ruled not by kings or generals, but by quiet women with sharper instincts than any handbook could teach. These nannies, these governesses, they shape the hush between teacups, the silence before a story, the way a child turned their head to listen. They rarely raise their voices, but somehow the entire rhythm of Victorian childhood beat to their pace. Through lace cuffs and tidy notebooks, they govern not just behavior, but emotion, memory, imagination. And though their names rarely echoed in history, halls their fingerprints remain in the phrases passed down, the habits absorbed, the bedtime stories half remembered in the dark. So now, as the shadows stretch a little longer across your room and the hum of the day grows faint, let their legacy settle gently in your thoughts. Think of the whispered lullabies. No one recorded the secret smiles exchanged behind disapproval, the quiet revolutions born in bedtime rituals and marmalade mornings. They were there in the margins, not forgotten, just waiting to be remembered by someone still awake. If you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it? And who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?